Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, April 26, 2018. Hi again, everyone. I'm Mario Helwani back inside our New York City studio for the second straight week. We're going 4 deep with the A team. That is very exciting. And at the end of this portion of today's show, we'll actually have some breaking news about the show, so stay tuned for that. For now, though, we shall say hello to the panel. That, of course, is Luke Thomas of SiriusXM and MMAfighting.com. That is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of ESPN, and of course, the anchor, Mr. Chuck Hall.
I like that. Pregnant pause.
I was waiting for the cough.
I was joking with you about the film in the water,
Yes.
but it looks like there might actually be.
There is something going on with our water.
Shouts to the cameraman.
Yeah,
for
Joe,
poisoning.
Boston's own Joe is poisoning our water.
Ooh.
Typical move by
Right now.
there.
You know,
that is the man in the hat.
Water, Boston, you're my home.
Yeah, Chuck Mindenhall of The Ringer and MMAfighting.com. Hello, Chuck.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Okay, let's talk, guys. I'm gonna throw a curveball right up the top. I like to do this. See, these guys, they like to know the topics in advance, and that's fine. We've been doing this long enough.
Pitch. That's what we like.
But I like to hide a couple. You know, I don't want to show you my full hand. So, what a week it has been for the UFC, my friends. Because look, they hire and fire people all the time. They sign people, they let them go all the time. But in the span of 5 days, as far as transactions go, this has been the UFC's week. They paid Leslie Smith to go away. They signed the very controversial Greg Hardy to the Contender Series, much to the chagrin of many people. And then, the feel-good story, they signed Nick Newell to be a part of the Contender Series. We've talked about Nick on this show. I think we've dabbled with Greg Hardy, and of course, we've talked about Leslie Smith and Project Spearhead, and we'll talk more about her situation in a moment. But let me start with this. Which was the biggest surprise? Paying Leslie Smith to just go away, signing Greg Hardy, who, by the way, is 0-2 as an amateur, not one pro fight on his record to Contender Series, or finally relenting.
2-0. I thought he was undefeated.
Excuse me, 2-0. Yeah. Sorry, 2-0, but no pro fights, and we know about his background and his baggage. And then you have Nick Newell, who in the past Dana White has said essentially, I'm not that interested. We know that he's a congenital amputee. There's a lot that goes in there. They finally relent and bring him on Contender Series. Biggest surprise of those three.
All three are surprising in their own way.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, you can go a lot of different directions with this. I guess I would say, granting that they're all surprising for different reasons in their own way, I would probably go with Leslie Smith. I would have said it's not that it's surprising that they didn't want to do business with her in some capacity, right? After the fact, you can say that. But it's not like anyone went into this week thinking, well, if Aspen Ladd doesn't make weight, I think this is probably the end of Leslie Smith. I didn't see anybody saying that. And the UFC does get wonky around weigh-ins where if you don't make weight, they get bitter with you and they cut to Marquez Johnson, or if you're Anthony Pettis and you try to leverage some money, they also get a little weird with you. So in that sense, I guess it's not surprising. But I thought that the way they handled it was so, like they wouldn't renegotiate with her, and they basically told her, look, you can get your full purse if you don't fight. And that's basically a best-case scenario for you here. So, to me, the way in which not that they chose not to do business with her, but the way in which they handled it, where they have now set themselves up for litigation, essentially, I find to be a little bit surprising. I actually, sadly, don't find it surprising that they signed Greg Hardy for the Contender Series, and I am mildly surprised, semi-surprised about Nick Newell.
I'm surprised to hear your pick.
Yeah?
I feel like that's the least surprising of the three.
It's if you zoom out and you just say, well, it's because she was an internal malcontent, then it's not surprising.
Right.
But the mechanics of the release, I thought were shocking, to be quite honest.
Usually they're aware of the kind of scrutiny that something like that would. They usually try to mitigate that sort of situation, but this time it was almost like, we're done. You know what I mean? That was, I guess, it was just the handling of it.
Abrupt.
Yeah, so it was very abrupt, and that's just unusual, right? So that's why that was weird. But I think it's got to be the Hardy thing for me, only in the sense because I think sometimes they do all three, like they do a bunch of these things at once so that you can't focus on any one thing. You're just kind of, it's all at once, you know? But the Hardy thing, honestly, man, like, it'd be one thing if he was this perennial all-pro, right? Like, this is a guy who made a Pro Bowl, what, once? I mean, it's not like he's this huge name. He's a guy who has, I like second chances. I know Dana White has talked about this. I like second chances. The fight game affords second chances. But this is, you know, when you have some kind of domestic abuse type thing, especially where, you know, you hear the details of that story, that's the kind of thing that stains your character, and it's very hard to overcome. I'm not sure he can overcome it, so I'm not sure where the redemption story is here. You know what I mean? To be completely honest. If you're just trying to bring in an audience to the Contender Series, which is fine, I guess I understand that side of it, but I hate being righteous on that, but it's the offense of what he did. I just didn't think that they would touch it in the end. I thought maybe he kind of flirted with the idea to get a sense of what people thought. I thought that it was kind of a negative backlash, honestly, when he first kind of dangled that idea maybe 6 months ago, and yet here we are. So I was a little bit surprised more. I would say that one got me a little more off guard than the rest. I think the Newell one, I thought it was 50-50.
Okay.
I think they're all pretty surprising, as Luke said, and the Leslie Smith part of it, I suspect that they were planning on letting her go after her fight, and then all of a sudden they had the rug pulled out from under them because there was no fight, and so they had to find another way to do it, and they did it in kind of a ham-handed way that, as you said, probably does open them up to has already opened them up to litigation. Whether that'll be successful or not, we don't know. And the other two, I guess I'll lump them together and say that my surprise takeaway is that we finally have kind of come up with a definition of what the Contender Series is. It's like this. It's almost like this little entryway into the UFC that is. It's like some people have like a mudroom coming into their house where you don't mess the whole house up, but you've just got this little place here that's set aside. And obviously there's going to be blowback for having Greg Hardy in your company, and I wonder whether he is good enough to warrant it. I mean, they must think very highly of him if they think that having him in is worthy. As far as Nick Newell, well, it is a feel-good story, but there's also the potential out in the bigger world of the culture. Everybody gets beat in this sport, and when the time comes that he gets beat in a UFC cage, and people out there who are not following the sport start commenting about it and start criticizing the UFC, they will at least have, tried him out in the Contender Series. So it's almost like this little venue is set aside from the UFC a little bit. We'll see how the trade winds blow, and if things are okay, then we bring these guys into the company as a whole.
The one quick thing on this, the reason why I didn't pick Greg Hardy, when they first announced it, I was like, wow.
And by the way, I just want to note, they haven't announced that. That's been reported. So you mentioned that these things get lumped together.
Fair.
This could have come out today.
Right. So they didn't announce it, but when the news broke, let's put it that way, I was like, wow. And then for 30 seconds later, I was like, oh, that makes sense. Because what ethically did he do, Greg Hardy, allegations or whatever you want to call it, that Floyd Mayweather didn't? Nothing. Nothing. In fact, Floyd might even be worse, to be quite honest with you. And
Floyd went to jail.
Floyd went to jail. They had his charges, Greg Hardy's expunged, in part because the victim refused to speak, but we all know there could be a lot of reasons for that.
Sure.
Point being is, they just did billion-dollar business with this guy. Now, granted, he's a huge star, so that makes a lot of sense, but I'm just saying, ethically, if you were going to draw the line at Floyd Mayweather, Greg Hardy is well below that.
Yeah.
But that's the thing, though, is there, it is worth doing business with Floyd because he is that megastar, and is Greg Hardy worth the trouble? That's really what you got to weigh.
The juice really isn't worth the squeeze with Greg Hardy because, again, he's 2-0 as an amateur, yet to have a pro fight. You've seen, I don't know if you guys have seen his fights and the level of opponent.
They had a guy literally run from him.
Yeah, I mean, this is not, so is the juice really worth the squeeze? Yesterday,
I was like, do you really think there's going to be substantial blowback for this? Because I don't.
I haven't seen, so I remember when we first reported that he was going to even try MMA, let alone had a fight booked. I remember within 30 minutes, First Take was debating it. And that was, almost 2 years ago now. So I think that his name is kind of fizzled in the world of pro football. But if you just look at Tough, and Tough is, the standards for Tough have gone way down, of course. They just announced yesterday that they're bringing in heavyweights and women's 145, which is like the two shallowest, maybe light heavyweight deserves to be in. Exactly. But they mentioned in there that you must have at least 3 pro fights, you must have a winning record, and you must be between ages 21 and 34. Like there are actual like stipulations and restrictions there. Greg Hardy, he doesn't fit, the top 2 of those, right? I mean, I guess he has a winning record, but it's an amateur winning record. He doesn't have 3 pro fights under his belt. And so I'm a little bit surprised that they would go out there and kind of expose themselves to this when he hasn't really shown himself to be still a big name in the world. Like, just look at the reaction to this news. Yes, it came out on a Saturday afternoon. There's a lot of NBA going on. So it's sort of, I didn't see it really picked up anywhere, but the reaction wasn't great. And he's kind of an unproven commodity as a football player, as an MMA fighter. But I want to go through these one by one here because I don't want to gloss over them completely. Let's start with Nick Newell because that's the freshest news. So yesterday, Dana White tells ESPN that he is in fact going to extend an invitation. And this is noteworthy because Dana White's extending an invitation, but also the outlet in which he's extending the invitation, not straight into the UFC. I saw that you tweeted that you felt that Nick is essentially, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like he's above this. He's proven himself to be bigger than the Contender Series. He should be getting a spot in the UFC. Why do you feel that way?
Just to clarify my position, I put this out on one of my podcasts on MMA fighting. I do not know how well he will do in the UFC. It remains very much unclear, but I do know that, look, nobody wins forever, but more or less you keep him on the regional scene, he's going to keep doing what he's been doing all this many times. In fact, I went and I looked up all the records of everyone from the first season of Dana White's Tuesday Night Contender Series. There was one fighter, who actually won his event, who had a record of, he had at least 10 wins and only 1 loss. Now, Nick Newell's at 14-1 now, right? So Nick Newell would be in very, very rare company like that. Most of the guys, there are some people who had like 22 wins, but then they would have like 8 or 9 losses. He is very, very unusual. And look, let's be real. It's progress. I can admit it's progress. It's a good story in that sense. But it just feels to me, I see all these arguments about like, well, what's going to happen if he loses? Millions of people watched his fight with Justin Gaethje, literally millions on NBC, not NBC Sports, NBC, and nothing happened. Nothing. These concerns about what will happen to the company if he gets beat up real bad, or we don't even know if he can compete. These ideas are rooted in ancient biases about the disabled, and we should call that plainly. That's exactly what it is. It's nothing more sophisticated than that. So, how will he do in the UFC if he makes it in? I don't know. But my only point is, putting him through the Contender Series, that's about promoting the Contender Series. That's not about vetting Nick Newell.
I thought...
It's really tough what you're saying. Like that, I see exactly what you're saying. I agree with it to an extent, but it's also when you look at, there's an old saying like I could beat him with a hand tied behind my back. Why is that even a saying? It's because there's a glaring deficiency perceived or whatever it is, right? Like I can beat you with one hand. He's the living embodiment of it, and it's so unique that he's doing that nobody else has done it. Like there's no other fighter that's done it. So. It's just, yes, you're probably right that there's going to be people who watch this and it's going to be weirdly uncomfortable, and especially if he gets beat up. I watched the Justin Gaethje one. It was a little weird because I remember thinking like, it was more that you didn't want to see him have a bad showing against a kind of a more of an elite guy just to prove the thing that he's been trying to prove. It didn't work out that way. It wasn't so much that you felt sorry for him or you were like, you see, he can never compete. It was just that it didn't match where you thought his narrative, the feel-good part of his narrative, But he made this is a great thing because it's associated with the UFC. He's going in there, something that has been his dream really to get to this spot. And now it's literally a tournament to try to actually get that contract. So in that sense, I really dig it. If he gets beat up badly in this setting, I can still see a scenario, regardless if you're right, it would be speaking to how people view the handicap, but I still believe that you would get backlash. It's not going to affect the company. It's just going to be a black mark on for that day or for that night. You know what I mean? Like it'd just be one of those things coming out of it. You see it and you think, why did they subject him to that if that happens? But I don't think it's going to have any big, long-lasting repercussions. You know what I'm saying? But
I really like it because I feel like we have been asking Dana White to give him a chance. Well, here he is giving him a chance. Second of all, what you said about...
When he said he never would.
Right. So, he has gone on the record.
It's progress.
You talked about this kind of being a way to prop up Contender Series. I don't disagree, but how is it any different than when they put Roy Nelson and Kimbo Slice on The Ultimate Fighter?
Those guys signed up for that.
And so did Nick Newell. Nick Newell signed up.
Okay, but Roy Nelson was probably, at the time, Tough was an incredible promotional vehicle.
Sure.
And he probably could have gotten signed without it. I don't know the mechanics of it exactly. Kimbo probably couldn't have. That was really his only way through.
And so here's Nick Newell, who there are some questions about, right? I think it's fair to say, okay.
We got to stop it.
What?
So many people have questions about Nick Newell who have not watched the tape on him.
I have watched the tape.
I know. And I'm not accusing you of it, but I'm really tired of having this debate about Nick Newell, about like what deficiencies he has.
I don't understand why you feel like the Contender Series is beneath him. If anything, I feel like this is Dana White putting his stamp on him and saying, I'm going to actually push this guy because now it's his show. It's not the UFC shows. We know it's under the umbrella.
You stamp on the guy, you just sign him and then promote him.
Yeah, you put him on the curtain jerker in Idaho, and no one's in the crowd, and Dana White's not even in attendance.
Put him on the main card of Fox Sports 1.
You're pushing him all the way there.
If you choose to, there's lots of different ways to promote him.
Dana's
You act like the Contender Series is the only way. It's not the only way.
No, it's not the only way. I actually think it's a brilliant way because A, you're building up Contender Series.
If it all works to plan, it's a good idea. Right?
Yeah.
I'm not denying that. Look what it did for Sean O'Malley, for example. So like if you go in there and you do well and you shine and you have a big speech and everything, and
Dana gets behind you.
Then he gets behind you because remember, if you win, it only makes you eligible it doesn't get you in.
Absolutely.
100%. I'm with you. It's a fine promotional vehicle, and I love the Contender Series. I'm calling it progress. But I'm also just detecting this whiff everywhere of everyone being like, well, what's he going to do about protecting people from his left side? If you go and watch the Justin Gaethje fight, even Justin Gaethje couldn't attack him from that side until the third round because he actually has really good defense on that
That's crazy
side.
talk.
There's just a lot. There's just, and if he loses two, everyone's like, well, what would the backlash be? Look at me. There will not be backlash.
There will not be. No,
it's the same. It's the same argument that got trotted out about women in the UFC. Oh my God, what will they say when they're covered in blood? Turns out, nothing.
It just feels to me like a creative way. They sat down, he said, look, you want a shot? I need your help in propping up my new show. And so they're working together. It feels to me like a creative way that they came together. He doesn't need help selling the FS1 prelims or the Fight Pass prelims, but the Contender Series is something that he clearly wants to validate. It's something that he feels strongly. To me, it feels like the heir apparent to Tough. So he's like, look, I'm not going to put you on Tough.
Which is great news.
And great news for Nick, and I know for a fact that he's happy about that. He did not want to go on Tough. He doesn't have to make weight 4 times, all that stuff. To me, it feels like they came together and said, look, you want something from me, I want something from you, let's make a deal.
Yeah, and I think this does... I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, Luke. I think that it is high time that we talk about Nick Newell as a fighter as opposed to a disabled fighter. I think that whole narrative, I mean, it is reality. You
can't just ignore it.
Every fighter,
it's an actual
of course,
thing that he has to deal with.
Every fighter, not every fighter has a disability, but every fighter has an inability. Every fighter has some part of their game. Sometimes it's their mental game. Sometimes they can't do certain things physically. Everybody has certain things. It's just that Nick Newell is very visible. It's right in front of you. So that's why it becomes part of his story. And, you know, his story is a brilliant one. And I think that one thing that I think is good about this is that this venue will allow the UFC to tell his story a little bit more for those people who don't know who he is. And so I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I do appreciate that we can look beyond the obvious disability and say, this guy's a hell of a fighter. Dana White is not an idiot. He would not be bringing this guy in if he thought this guy was going to come in and get smoked. He thinks this guy can fight, but he just, he wants to put him into a place where they can sort of, dip their toe into
UFC was not putting him on a main card. They very rarely put newcomers on a main card unless you're someone who's like truly. If they signed Michael Chandler, I'm assuming he'd be on a main card. They weren't putting him on a main card. So this to me feels like the exact same thing as an undercard. Like, what's the difference? The only difference is Dana White is personally invested in his own show, and he wants to kind of use him. I'm not saying negatively, but kind of use him to prop up that new show.
It's also a function of how they match him, who they match him up against.
That's very important.
Right. So I mean, let's see who they give him. They give him somebody really tough. Okay, that changes the debate a little bit. If they give him somebody, he just runs over them, whatever. But I don't know. I just, for me, again, I want to be very clear about this. I'm happy for Nick Newell, and I hope he goes in there and does everything that he thinks he can, and we're curious to see if he can do. But this debate, it's like, well, Dana White thinks he's a good fighter. The entire record of what Dana White has said about this guy has been prevailing skepticism and intransigent skepticism. The kind you're just like, do you not look at the footage on this guy?
Probably he hasn't.
Right, and so it just kills me when we have to have these arguments. I have no problem putting a guy like Nick Newell on the Contender Series if it's all in good faith. But there's a part of me that feels like it's cynical about Nick Newell's upside and just cynical about promoting the Contender Series. And maybe that's because I'm a negative person, which I can admit.
But let's not pretend that the UFC hasn't signed guys who deserve to be in the UFC. So like Nick Newell, not
like Greg Hardy or something.
No, like Ben Askren, like Fedor Emelianenko.
Yes, sorry.
You know what I mean? Like sometimes they have these weird grudges. I mean, Joe Silva was the king of this, where he's just like, I don't want this guy in here, and I'm going to do whatever it takes. And my understanding is there were matchmakers in the UFC who did not want, him to come and
Nick Newell.
Yes, because they don't want this on their head.
Right.
I got enough problems. I got 600 fighters on my roster. Why do I have to worry with the 1% chance that something goes wrong here? That's the way. So to me, this feels like, look, it really does feel like the best of both worlds, and it feels to me like. I guess I'm hopeful that if he wins, as you correctly pointed out, he's not guaranteed. But I'd like to think that there's some sort of agreement that if he wins, he's getting by. Like this is.
I would think so.
You know what I mean? Because it would be crazy. Could you imagine if he wins and they don't offer him a contract?
What if he wins and he barely scrapes by on a split decision? He's covered in blood. They're just going to give him a contract? I don't know about that.
Yeah, I guess there's levels to winning.
But that's the proof is in the pudding. I mean, he has to actually perform. If he scrapes by against a guy who is at a low level, then was he worth the contract in the beginning?
Fair enough.
I guess my question is now that if he does win, and if they do put him on a main card next, And I guess they would be wise to put him either on a big Fox main card. You know, there's a story to be told here, and a lot of people would get behind it. How big of a deal could this be? Like, is this the kind of thing that the UFC can really capitalize on, in the sense that, like, Good Morning America is talking? There's an amazing story here.
For that sort of thing, yes. He already has it. One of the rare pieces I did for ESPN the magazine was about Nick Newell.
Yeah.
That's the kind of outlet that will suddenly be interested. He will have that kind of appeal. It's just how will it do in terms of the actual space? Like, I feel like for people like us, we watched him fight. We know what he can do. I don't think we really, any of us really doubt his ability. We know what he can do, but I don't know how he'll be perceived ultimately. That's the part that it waits to be seen. If he plows through guys, you can't help but think he'll just be a feel-good story in a sport where this shouldn't, you know what I mean? Like, the narrative always with MMA is like, it's the Wild West, and these guys, there's no rules and all this. And for a guy to succeed, you know, just like when they looked in at Ronda Rousey, here's the baddest woman on the planet, suddenly they're paying attention to MMA. It'd be the same thing. The people who would look in on the sport would just see an inspirational story. I know that Jim Abbott and guys like that have been advocating for him for a long time, you know, just getting behind him. And you can see that. I can see that. I think that that's part of what's awesome about it. It's also awesome that he blurs the line. He doesn't make you see. In the end, you don't see his handicap. You only see his prowess as a fighter.
Right.
That's what over the years, you don't really think about it anymore. You're just like, when if he takes him down, or, you know, what is he going to do? And it's a matter of time for a lot of these guys. So that's a credit to him. So I think that his story will have multiple layers, and that's the kind of thing it will do for the UFC. Is it outlets that normally would not cover the sport would suddenly be covering the sport.
Yeah,
again.
totally. The UFC is always looking for people who can break that wall, and they have very rarely had those people. They had Ronda Rousey, they have Conor McGregor, or we think they still have Conor McGregor, and can you name some others? Chuck Liddell for a while was doing some things, but for the most part, it's a rarity for the UFC or MMA in general to have somebody who breaks into the larger, certainly the larger sports media maybe, but the larger cultural media as well, like Paige Van Zandt being on Dancing with the Stars. These kinds of things that I think are a big deal for this company. Well, here's a guy whose story is organic and real and feel good. I mean, and inspiring. These are all the things. I mean, he's the anti-Greg Hardy. I mean, this is, you know, Greg Hardy. Nick Newell.
Which makes those two things happening on the same week very strange, right? Like, to me, this is a way. Yeah, this is the way of saying to people, like, the Contender Series is something we feel very strong. Like, I think people need to get over the fact that the Contender Series is beneath anyone. I think they really.
Do I?
Well, because it's going to be the new tough. It's a big thing.
The Contender Series is changing from season one. I think that's a certain reality.
Absolutely.
It's great that O'Malley came out of that whole thing has really helped the situation, right? Because all of a sudden there's a star already kind of building out of that, so it helps.
Sorry, go ahead. Just one thing about the upside. Look, I don't think he can beat the elite of the UFC. I could be wrong, but that's my hunch.
But you know, there's 50% of the roster who can't beat the elite.
It's also the toughest division in the sport. So there's something to be said, like, you know, James Vick was unranked for all these times. Good luck fighting James Vick.
Sure.
I don't care who you are, you're going to need it, right? Yeah. So there's that. But I do think this. I think everyone's talking about, like, how would it be good for the mainstream? Well, it would be, because folks who just came to the sport in the last few years may not remember, but when Nick Newell, before he walked away from the sport, for fighters even inside the UFC, but for sure outside the UFC, I've never seen a guy get mainstream press like that. People were asking and doing stories on him all the time, okay? So I think if he was actually in the UFC and performing ably, it would do well. But there's another aspect to the story that no one's talking about. There's a huge portion, forget the mainstream, there's a huge portion of the martial arts community that have similar kinds of handicaps. There are blind wrestlers. I know, I've been down to Walter Reed. I know the guy who runs the Paralympic Jiu-Jitsu, or the Para-Jiu-Jitsu program down there. He's a Yamasaki black belt. All kinds of guys and veterans coming home with missing arms and missing legs. And there's actually in Abu Dhabi competitions for this. All these people, you talk to them, to a man, look up to Nick Newell. They mention him by name every time. That guy should be given a chance that, to me, just doesn't feel like we're trying. I don't know. It bothers me a little bit.
It bothers you that he's not the curtain jerker in Idaho.
They're not going to Idaho.
They are going. What do you mean? They are going to Idaho on July 14th.
All right. They're going to relive. They're going to relive Carvalho Manhoff 1.
They might have to cancel without Nick Newell to be able to.
There are lots of ways to put him on a big card. Even if you put him on Fox Sports 1, that would be no different than what they did for Mackenzie Dern, right? Fighting Amanda Cooper.
But that's ignoring how strongly they feel about Contender Series. They're in the midst of TV negotiations. They want to sell Contender Series to people. Look what we're doing. We're putting Greg Hardy on there. We're putting
I know, but
Nick
for an
Newell.
organization that did the Heisman for this guy for year after year after year, all of a sudden to flip a switch. One, it's because his manager lobbied effectively on his behalf, which deserves to be acknowledged. The other one is that it's like, well, maybe we could get some rub out of this. It is not because a light bulb went off in their head and they're like, wow, maybe this guy can fight.
No one's claiming that. The light bulb is we have TV negotiations.
Okay, then say what it is.
Well,
It's
they're not gonna
about
come out and say it. They don't
But
say-
I'm saying
they
we're
never say
having
that
this
about
debate. We
anything.
should have it candidly.
Yeah, that's
it's
what
about
I'm
promoting
saying.
Contender Series. It's not because there's been enlightenment about the abilities.
Who said that here?
I think a lot of people are saying, well, I don't know how I feel about him. Well, then say that. Say that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone on this panel has said that.
No.
Yeah, I mean, there may be some people out there who...
There's prevailing skepticism about it.
There may be
About
some,
Nick Newell?
Yes.
On this panel?
No, I don't know about this panel.
Well, that's who we're addressing. We can't address Joe Schmo.
But the larger debate is certainly inclusive of people who just...
I love the idea. Oh, well, how will he do against the top 10? That's ludicrous to me.
How
Like,
would anybody do against the top 10?
like Sage Northcutt, how would he do against the top 10? Like we can talk about how would Sean O'Malley do against the top 10? We don't know that answer. There was once I've had people say like, okay, well if you can't, if you're not willing to say how he'll do against the top 10, because we honestly don't know, like who would he fight? And I'm not going to put you guys on the spot, but I remember not that long ago. I don't know if you guys remember this story when he was fighting for Access TV. There was a feud between him and Scott Holtzman, and Holtzman said that he was ducking him, and that one of them was a champ. Scott Holtzman's in the UFC. I think that's a fine fight. Like Scott Holtzman is
That's the caliber, right?
What's
there.
wrong with making that fight? I don't know why people would be afraid to make that fight. That's the part that I don't quite. I can't wrap my head around that one. Like, what do you think is really going to happen in that fight that is going to be so bad compared to stuff that we've seen, this past, like horrible knockouts?
Look, once he performs on the Contender Series, and if he does what he's done before, if he does what's made him a 14-1 fighter, with the only loss being against a really top guy, if he goes out there and fights well and gets into the the actual UFC or whatever you want to call it, then he's on his own. I mean, he's going to have to perform. He's going to have to keep performing just like everybody else. And I think that's what he would welcome. I don't think he wants to be, I don't think he wants every single story written about him to mention, that he's an amputee in the first paragraph. Wait till the 17th paragraph to say, oh, by the way, this guy who just did this and this and this and this.
That's not going to happen.
Of course it isn't.
I saw the headline on ESPN. It was like the third word in the headline.
Of course. I mean, of course, because that is...
It was actually just amputee.
Of course, but that is part of his story. But he wants people to think of him as a fighter, and the more that he goes out there and does what he does, the closer to that he gets.
A lot of the prevailing skepticism, real quick, is I really believe the Dana White thing, right? If Dana had been right away like, hey, man, I can cash in on this guy, there might not have been that. But he was the one. I remember when he did the scrums and people would ask him or, things like that. It was always skepticism, or he would just be like, no, it's just not happening. It was pretty much a shrug off. And I feel like a lot of that attitude, it's only because it's the UFC, right? Like, I feel like that comes from Dana himself. So it's kind of in a roundabout way. It's actually poetic in a weird sense that he's bringing them onto that show too. In that way, like if you want to look at where the skepticism comes from, well, now they're going to a confrontation on that show.
And he was surprised Newell. He was like, Newell has a license in Nevada? Yeah.
At the end of the day, I think this falls on Sean Shelby's shoulders because he's the one who's going to have to book him. He's the one who's like Dana's not. People need to know that Dana is not usually like signing people for the Dana White Contender
100%.
Series. That falls on Sean Shelby and Mick Maynard's shoulders, and Sean oversees 155, and he's the one who's going to have to book him either correctly or incorrectly, tough matchup or not. And so I think we'll get a gauge very, very quickly as to how Sean Shelby feels about all of this, based on who he matches him up against. He could put him in there against a guy who's 1-0, and I don't think anyone will bat an eye. But if he puts him in there against a guy who's 15-1 or something like that, and the thing to me that I feel for Nick Newell is, let's say he loses via like body shot, right? Like just a shot that would drop anyone. The first thing people are going to mention is, it's because
Right.
Everyone gets knocked out, everyone gets submitted, but they're going to use that against him. And that to me is kind of a bummer, but...
That's his burden. It's going to be his burden forever. It doesn't matter what happens. I mean, anything that happens, they will be able to construe that way,
Okay, let's move along. Let's talk about the Leslie Smith situation. So...
Speaking of grudges, you were talking about that,
yeah, Leslie Smith was booked to fight Aspen Ladd. Leslie Smith is the interim president of Project Spearhead. We've talked about Project Spearhead on this show. This was the last fight on her contract, and they had not talked about an extension. She finds out that Aspen Ladd did not make weight, there was an offer to take 20% of her purse. Aspen Ladd claims that she also offered an extra $5,000. Leslie Smith said that offer never came to her. And in the end, she was told, look, we're just going to pay you your win and show, which equals out to $62,000. And that will be the fulfillment of your contract. She believes, even though she has said that she was not told directly, she believes the reason why they essentially made this unprecedented move. The unprecedented move, by the way, is not the paying of the win and show. They've done this before, most notably Ian McCall not that long ago. The unprecedented move is you're fulfilling your contract. We're buying you out, essentially. We don't want you to fight again. She was never told directly that it's because of her involvement with Project Spearhead, but that seems to be, the prevailing wisdom. That's the elephant in the room. Now, as you mentioned, she is planning on, filing a lawsuit. That's what she's said publicly. The part that I can't really come to terms with, and I think we've all been pretty open on this show about the fighters needing an association, collective bargaining, revenue sharing, things like that. What was illegal about this? Like, they had a contract. They're able to fulfill it by paying her out. Like, what? There is no association. There's no reason given as to why. They just said, we're buying you out. We don't have a fight for you. You're not accepting this fight. We don't want to give you $100,000 as you're asking. Does she really have a leg to stand on? Unfortunately, if Project Spearhead isn't around, if it was around, we're talking about a different story. But like, what was done illegally here? That's the part that I can't quite understand.
Well, isn't the idea, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, but isn't the idea that now she can sue and have the NLRB look at the merits of the dismissal and weigh in about whether or not they have to then assess whether or not she is an employee or independent contractor, correct?
I mean, that's what she's saying. She's also saying, I'm going to sue, but
and
again,
even if they decide she's an independent contractor, they can still go forward with the unionization effort with the signing of the cards.
Yes. Her initial hope was getting 30% of the roster to sign the cards. Of course, now she loses some strength.
So what she has to do is she has to go before them, and she has to say, look at this. They did, if you are an employee, here's how they broke the rules.
But how did they break the rules?
Right, hold on, let's just say, she has to say that, and they have to say, well, we can only make the determination if you're an employee. That's what she's trying to do. Now, you're asking, how did they break the rules? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a judge. This is very, very difficult for me to weigh in on that specific thing. You're asking, did they follow the letter of the law? My reading of it is probably so, but I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think you can actually do what you are contractually allowed to do, and they can imagine if they have a secret tape recording, and I'm literally positing something totally imaginary.
Yeah.
But imagine they have a secret tape recording of Dana White and Sean Shelby saying, all right, this is a great way to cut her out at the knees.
That changes everything.
Right, but here's my point. I realize you have to have that evidence.
Yeah.
But you would still be taking the same legal path to get rid of her. You would just be having extra evidence to show that the motivation behind it was...
But this can't be... Go ahead.
Her lawyer, Lucas Middlebrook, went on Twitter and cited a specific law or at least regulation. Now, obviously, none of us has the ability to interpret the law in that way and understand if this was legal or illegal. But there is some case law that he will argue in her favor, and then we just have to find out whether he's just going out on a limb trying to throw a Hail Mary, or whether there is some solid ground. I don't think it's certainly not in my pay grade to be able to suss out whether there's real, if she has a real case or not.
Unless
but
they told her directly that the reason why we don't want to be in business with you is because you're trying to unionize our fighters, and you're being.
But how do you know that that's? How do you? Right. I mean, how do you know that they need that as a burden of proof? I mean, I think ultimately
they don't have to be in business with anyone. They're a private company. They don't want to be in business with X, Y, and Z. They don't have to say, look, we paid you. You were causing a bit of a ruckus earlier in the week. They can cite that. She asked for more per diem money. She asked for her luggage.
It goes back further because obviously, she was kind of if you're looking at it from a UFC's standpoint, she was kind of a pain in their ass beforehand, because there was what was the whole thing? There was a surgery she needed or something like this. You know what I'm talking about?
On her stomach, yeah.
And she kind of went public with this, and I remember at the time, UFC people within the UFC were pretty mad because they were like, hey, we were going to work this all out. She didn't need to go that route. There's been some hard feelings, some strained tension between them anyway. So you can infer, honestly, that there might be multiple reasons, and the Project Spearhead probably being the catalyst ultimately in the end. But I look at it as UFC is a private company, the independent contract, all that, but if you're in a sports team, like a sports league and a sports team, and they buy out contracts all the time, and it could be for any variety of reasons. It can be for misconduct. It can be for you got hurt and somebody came up and they're better than you. It could be for whatever reason they want to make it. That's the way I saw this really realistically. It's just At some point, you're like, you know what, it's time for us to part ways. Here's our opportunity. But that's the way I see it. I don't really understand all the legal ramifications, like how they're going to play this. But from my mind, that is pretty black and white in that sense. So they paid her the money. I'm not sure to what they'd be seeking beyond that.
I wonder whether she had the opportunity to decline the win money in order to perpetuate her contract. I mean, I'm not sure that would have, if there's a benefit to her.
She tried to negotiate a new deal. And
what
she
if
asked,
she had one fight left on her deal, so she didn't necessarily need to.
But she was saying, I don't want the 20%. She said she was making a point that I don't want to fight someone who missed weight, but if you extend my contract, if you give me X, Y, and Z, if you pay me this much, okay, now we could talk. So look, she shot her shot. She saw an opening, and that's something that John Dotson did against Pedro Munoz. It didn't work out for him. The UFC doesn't. They don't respond.
They don't like to be leveraged.
They don't respond favorably, especially when you're trying to galvanize the troops.
Around weigh-ins in particular.
I think
they get real bitter.
I think that we can all acknowledge that the UFC, when Leslie Smith's contract runs its course, wanted her to no longer be a UFC fighter. I think that, if she had gone out and fought, I think that would have been it. I think this is a gray area. I mean, again, we're not lawyers here, but it just seems like just because they pay her a contractual, what's due to her contractually, I don't know whether they, we'll find out, whether they then have the right to just cut her loose or whether there is some other obligation they have. I mean, I think that, I just don't think it's as cut and dry as you're saying.
I don't know if I see the difference between her actually fighting on Saturday and them saying, thanks for your time and goodbye. And on the flip side, the reality is, opponent missed weight. We offered you 20% and fight. She said no. She tried to negotiate a new deal. They said no. Let's just pay you what you were going to make tomorrow to fight. And she could have still fought. She said it herself.
She chose not to fight.
She chose because she said, I'm essentially fighting for free because you already told me that I'm getting my win. So it feels like a decision on her part not to fight. Would anyone have batted an eye on Sunday if she fought that fight on Saturday, won via decision or knockout or submission, and they didn't extend? I don't think any of us are really all that surprised. To me, a light bulb has to go off for Cajun Johnson and Ally Quinta, who are the only fighters who have sort of publicly put their names out there. They both have multiple fights left on their deal, but then what happens? Now, if there's a bit of a trend, if everyone who's involved in this thing is gone.
Quinta just got some goodwill, though.
Yeah, well, the thing is, a couple things. I interviewed Cajun Johnson after his last win, so before his next one was announced, and I asked him, what kind of opponent are you looking for? He's like, I'm looking for somebody with a name. And they gave him Islam Makhachev, a super tough guy.
A long name.
Who basically has no name. And I was like, that's not what he was looking for. That's kind of interesting. Also, with the difference with you, I think what she might argue is, well, look at all the post-fight bonuses I got, and I was ranked inside the top 10.
Yeah.
You can have a debate about what those rankings really are, but it'd be a little unusual to get rid of somebody in that kind of position in another weight class, for whatever that's worth. But I will say, I think you are onto something. It reminds me a little bit of this Kaepernick situation with the league.
100%.
Because he has to prove collusion. And you can think whatever you want about Kaepernick, and you can think whatever you want about his exclusion from the league, and whether or not the owners are keeping him out in for a particular reason beyond his football abilities. But it doesn't matter what you can believe. What matters is what you can prove. Now, maybe this new phone call that they recorded is part of that, but if you don't have that phone call or you don't have documentation, your theories and your inferences about collusion are, for a court of law, irrelevant.
And especially when there isn't an association even in place who can back you here.
And it's not like it's unprecedented for the UFC to do this. Now, for the quarterback situation, it's something that we hadn't really seen, and there was a lot that went into it. Obviously, this is a guy who played in the Super Bowl just a couple seasons before. His stats and everything, he should be in the league. You know he's good enough to be in the league. We know Leslie Smith can compete, but so could Yushin Okami, and so could guys like John Fitch.
Jake Shields.
There's just something about, are they worth it in the end for the UFC? And I feel like that's always the thing with the UFC. If you're not producing for them, maybe you're winning, maybe you are top 10, but you're just not drawing eyeballs, you're not doing in that, and then you're causing, it makes sense from their business perspective to think like this, you know what I mean?
No one could possibly be surprised that they don't want to be in Leslie Smith's, in business with her, right? No one's surprised by this.
I'm not surprised, but the one thing I'll say is this. I mean, even though I agree with Chuck, some of the things that she had said and done in the past were a bit of a pain in the ass for them. The rhetoric I was hearing from her whenever there was some talk about this Project Spearhead was that she was wanting to work with the UFC, and it was not as confrontational as I've heard like back when, you know, the Bjorn Rebney thing and all these, it seems like there have been other unionization or association efforts that were a little more confrontational. And she seemed like someone who wanted to work with this organization. And if I'm the UFC and it's inevitable that at some point these fighters are gonna work together, I probably want to have someone who's a little bit more rational, like her.
You're being naive right now when you say
I
that.
am, of course.
Yeah, the UFC is. I mean, this is the company that fought, you know, the Fertittas, of course, but like they're not anti-union. The Station Casinos. I know it's new management here, but Dana White is still there. They don't want to deal with this. They have it perfect now. They don't have to answer to anyone. And that's,
there has been a bit of a shift too. My understanding is that I'm sure that they're not pleased about things like this, but at the same time, you know, I remember after Alak went to one of these Twitter tirades, somebody told me that like a week later, they wanted to give him tickets to a local fight to come see it, and I think he did. You know, they're not.
But is that being open to unionization, or is that trying to quiet people?
I don't think it's trying to quiet them. I think that they're a little bit softer than they used to be. I think their backbone about being anti-union. You're right. That posture still is there. But my thought was, I'm sure they're not like super thrilled about Leslie Smith, but I didn't think they would just go like that very, very quickly.
Yeah, the people who run this organization now are the people. These folks work at entertainment, and entertainment has tons of unions. Every film set has union upon union. So they're a little bit more used to working in that environment. Whereas the Fertittas, well, you know, there wasn't a lot of unionization
but
in
this current structure benefits them so much more than if they open that door to unionization. You know what I mean?
Sure, but is it? I'm not saying that the UFC wants there to be an association, but
so why be in business with someone who is, you know, internal, who's able to talk to people, fight weak?
Because the next person who becomes the head of something might be a little bit more confrontational, might be somebody who's not as easy to work with.
Also, you can't get rid of them because they want to unionize. That's illegal.
No, but okay, great point. So now here's the misstep that I think was made. She had one fight left on her deal. Project Spearhead was announced, I don't know, off the top of my head, maybe around February or January. She had not fought since then. What I would have done, and if I was advising her, get a new deal, be quiet about this, sign the new deal, and then you come out with Project Spearhead. You don't come out with Project Spearhead when you have one fight left on your deal, because now you've given them a reason to say goodbye to you. You know, now of course, brings up the other problem, which a union could help with. They could cut you after one fight. You sign a new 6-fight deal, you lose that one fight. It's not guaranteed. I guess there are things that you can do. You could say, hey, you can't cut me after 2 or 3 fights. But to me, it felt like a bit of a misstep in hindsight to announce this while you're essentially about to hit free agency. Do you get what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty good point.
Yeah. So we'll see how this pans out. The one thing I wanted to ask you guys, last thing about this, is do you feel, you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, do you feel like she'll now be blackballed? Like, will Bellator not want to be in business with her?
Oh.
Well, you know, like, is it possible that everyone's going to be like, we don't want this in our company. We don't want to deal with this. Of course, she's a female fighter who fights at 135, who could go to 125. That's pretty much it. She's fought at 140 against Cyborg. There aren't a ton of options for her. You know, there's Invicta, obviously, but she's not going to make that same kind of money. Is it possible that Leslie Smith will be blackballed now?
Very possible. Very possible. Scott Coker.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it, but I was just saying I could see that, but Coker's so strangely, he's such a strange player, you know, like in all this, because he every now and again he'll do stuff just to rankle the other side. So you never know, but honestly, I don't see the upside for him to play that game.
Right now?
Yeah, not really. I mean, they don't really have much of a division either. So it's like there's not a lot of upside to bringing her over there.
Does this spell the end of Project Spearhead? Does she lose all power at the moment? How about the fact that I didn't see any fighters outside of Cage and Johnson publicly defend her? No one came to her defense last Friday. How demoralizing must that be for someone who is literally putting their neck out? They are essentially playing with fire here, like with their own employment, right? Their own dreams. In the prime of her career, she's never fought better, and no one was sticking up for her except for Cajun. Cajun I saw very loud. No one.
Al?
I have to go back and check, but and of course I wasn't looking through all 500, but you tend to see these things pop up. I didn't see. Did you guys see anyone else stick up for her?
Eric Spicely did.
Okay, good for him.
Eric Spicely did, yeah. It was more about Aspen Ladd missing weight, but he was pretty clear about it.
But there wasn't a ton.
Sure. No, there's not.
That says a lot about the current state of where the fighters are at with their their unionization efforts.
If her dispute does get to the NLRB and kind of gets a little bit of traction there, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing for Project Spearhead. You know, if suddenly this becomes a thing.
Sure.
And she can push it forward, whether she wins in the end or loses, at least pushing it forward and getting it into the public eye, that would seem like it's a good thing for the association or the potential association.
Last thing on this, I will say that publicly, I don't know, there was not much support. You're right about that. I will say that there's a bit of a whisper network around him. I get a lot of questions off the record about, you know, what are they up to? Who are they? I get a few of those.
Sure, but it would be nice to have some public support.
No doubt about it.
I was also curious to see if this would break through the MMA bubble. Like, you know, what did Dan Patrick talk? This is a pretty juicy story. Maybe not the best week for it with the NFL draft, playoffs, and all that. But this is a pretty juicy story that I think, you know, an Outside the Lines or a Real Sports on HBO, I think would be all over this. Of course, that takes a lot of time to put together those stories. But this kind of seems like it has been contained within the MMA bubble, which is unfortunate for them.
To your point, do you know what a recent MMA story Outside the Lines did cover? Which is a fine story to cover, but...
Did it come out yet?
Yeah, it's already been out yet. It was the Paige Van Zandt revelation about the sexual...
not that one. I didn't see that one. The weight cutting?
No. About the
her
sexual... yes, about the sexual misconduct or whatever she suffered from. I'm not sure of the exact allegations insofar as that's concerned, but they brought that up, but they didn't touch this one.
Yeah.
So.
It's very possible it never got to their doorstep.
Could be.
Jeff, that's on you.
I'll fix that. Yeah, I'll take care of it. I'll get those guys on the phone right after the show.
Okay, let's talk about the lightweight division, the most fascinating division. I will concede to an argument that we had maybe 2 years ago when we debated at the time. But as things have evolved,
it was neck and neck.
Yes, as things have evolved, it has become the glamour division, the deepest division, the most interesting division. And right now we have Khabib as the official champ.
But this is the story of my life. I make an argument, and that takes about 2 years to catch up to. That's why I want to know that.
But look, you know, here I am. Yes. I'm conceding. I want to know how you guys would book the division, because I feel like there's like 8 different ways that you could go with this. And these are the cards that, you know, I'm handing out. I'm handing out Khabib, obviously. I'm handing out Conor. I'm handing out Tony Ferguson. Let's assume that he's going to be back by the end of the year. I'm handing out Nate Diaz. I'm handing out Dustin Poirier. I'm handing out Eddie Alvarez. And there's a couple of, Kevin Lee. I was going to say Kevin Lee. There's James Vick out there. There's a couple of wild cards. Of course, Kevin Lee coming off a very impressive win. He did miss weight. It's a little tricky. How do you reward that sort of thing? I feel like the precedent has been set with Yoel Romero. He's getting a title shot after missing weight, so they're not going to really hold that against them. But how are you guys? Jeff, let's start with you. How are you booking this thing?
I'm going ping pong balls in the lottery. And we just like put all the names in there and they all go. Actually, you know,
that's the best way to go. Make a show out of it. Can you imagine that?
Exactly. When you started talking about this, now, was it last week? Was it 2 weeks ago? At one point, you sort of threw out there, you know, a bunch of fights. And because I think we had this conversation, and all I was thinking about was what's next for Nurmagomedov. And
I thought you were going to say Conor, because you have a one-track mind.
Well,
it's a joke.
I guess I have a two-track mind now. So what's next for the champion, right? And so I, you know, say, well, you know, McGregor should be the guy, but if that doesn't pan out because of legal issues or whatever, then, you know, then Ferguson. Well, if Ferguson isn't healed yet, then, you know, then Poirier. Like, you know, so I think there are so many moving parts here in terms of who's going to be available when. Is McGregor's legal issues going to haunt him, or is he going to be pretty much, you know, skating free soon? What's Tony Ferguson's leg looking like, you know, in a few months?
Let's just say they're all available by November.
I mean, to me, you just have Nurmagomedov and McGregor is the fight, and everything else has to fall off of that.
We all agree with that one?
Yeah.
Okay, we all agree with.
Ideally,
yes.
We're putting
everyone's available for November timeframe. We all agree with Khabib and Conor. Okay,
that's the only one I care about.
That's the only one you care about.
I want the time. Everybody else, I really believe that you can make a claim for any other matchup, and it would not be. Would not be a disservice to the division, really. I mean, I feel like that's the one matchup that if they're all available, really should be made. And then after that, all those other guys could
Poirier, Alvarez, obviously, just because of their history, it makes sense to run that back. Given, especially like if you just look where the rankings are a mess, but like if you just look at where they are, I would still like to see that fight. So that would be up there. I don't know if it'd be like ideal, but that would be up there.
What do you do with Kevin Lee?
That's a good question, man.
Does he get punished for missing weight?
I don't think so. So it feels like he's missed weight twice, just given the way his weight cut went the last time
But he
with the
did.
staph infection. He did not. But it felt like it was just so scary at the time and all this. So it almost feels like we're dealing in a pattern, but we're really not. It's a one-time thing. So as of right now, no, I would not punish him. It's always the second time that they officially miss weight that I'm like, okay, you can't trust that situation. I don't know with Kevin Lee, man. I mean, they have so many. I mean, I pointed this out before. I don't know who you put Nate Diaz in when he's ready, but just imagining that fight, the build-up to it and everything, and like Nate Diaz against Kevin Lee. Just just those two guys, one from Detroit, one from the 208. You know what I mean? Like, I love that sort of concept, and I think it'd be a fun fight. You could do something like that, but I don't know. I mean, you go down, you start to get into that middle tier, and they're all so good. Like you mentioned, James Vick and stuff. I don't even know what you do with guys like that, but you feel like he needs a step up as well. Like he needs to step up and to really see where he's at. I don't know. Who do you got?
Man, this is a tough one. I actually do like the idea of like Champions League draw. Where it's
fun would that be?
That would be cool.
I think it'd be because honestly, is that process really worse than what we could come up with? Probably not.
Yeah.
Wow, can you imagine?
So I would say, okay, so Conor Habib is one.
Imagine getting all 8 guys like on
I
stage.
mean, are you kidding? It would
Fight pass would explode.
It'd be phenomenal to do that. So so let's say you did that. The Conor Habib right, is a given. I'll just say what fights I'd like to see. I kind of feel like if there's some way to fall out, I would like to see Dustin Poirier get the title shot, and the reason why is because he's got the 2 wins in a row. Eddie's got the 1. They had the similar opponent, but he also has the win over Pettis. The 2 counts more than the 1 in my judgment. But if that's not going to go that way, you could put those 2 together.
Wait, but I thought you said Conor Habib.
Conor Habib.
So how does Poirier get the title shot?
I'm saying if he has to be like the alternate or something like that. So because you have to kind of wonder how they're going to book that.
Okay.
They're going to have extra lightweights on that card. I don't know how they're going to put the matches together, or they're going to have someone on the side. But the fights I'd like to see, again, if everyone's healthy, and I don't know what their preferences are, I'd like to see Nate Diaz versus Tony Ferguson. Yeah. I feel like that would be kind of phenomenal in its own way. I would like to see Eddie Alvarez versus Dustin if they have to make one. And I don't really know what you do with Kevin Lee, because that performance was incredible, but where does he fit into the mix? There's like a piece missing here. So I don't know. I mean, you could sub him in. You could do Lee versus Alvarez, Lee versus Diaz,
Lee versus Vic.
Yeah. Lee versus Vic.
There's all these possible rematches that I know they to some extent could be deserved, but I do like those fresh matchups. Like I mean, as much as I like Poirier and Alvarez, running it back would be awesome. On the other hand, it'd be awesome to see each of those guys face a new and different challenge. Yeah. I don't know if I want to see Ferguson against Lee again.
No.
Right?
No,
so
I don't think
so there's different.
I want to see that.
I mean, eventually.
Right away, no, but like I'm definitely curious to see what a fresher.
Like I wouldn't want to see it as the next fight.
Sure, okay.
But it's down the road.
What about Nate Diaz versus Eddie Alvarez in L.A.? Imagine that.
I feel like any
Staples Center.
You can play
I don't want to see that.
You don't want to see it. Why?
Because Eddie will wrestle him the entire time.
You think so?
Why don't we play a game? Let's play a game. Let's try to come up with. We have all these lightweights. Let's find a matchup that we think is really horrible and nobody would want to watch. Go. Anybody?
Oh, that's impossible.
There's none. I mean, really, we could not sit here and say no matter what combination you throw out there, it's going to be
except
really
for
good.
Conor fighting anyone outside of Khabib. That one I feel very strongly about because of what happened.
Even
in Brooklyn.
Tony?
I think Ferguson.
Yes.
I think Ferguson would be a.
Again, if you flew from Ireland to cause a ruckus of any kind, and you compete in a sport where you're essentially allowed to beat up a man, no holds barred. Like if you blow on someone in the NBA, you get suspended, right? In this sport, you get to walk in there barefoot with 4-ounce gloves and beat the crap out of someone you don't like. Then you have to fight him now. You have to.
Yeah, that's my first choice.
Yeah, of course.
But I wouldn't cry if they.
I wouldn't cry, but I feel like now you got to do it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Plus, it's so so damn big at this point. I mean, it would just make.
So how would you book it?
So probably one.
I mean, Conor Khabib is the way to go. I want to put Nate Diaz on that August card in LA because I think that's just huge, and I don't know if that card is making a lot of money right now. So I would do Nate Diaz versus Eddie or Eddie versus Poirier on that card, which depending on which way you go. There's just that one thing that I can't ignore with Eddie right now is that he has one fight left and they're really far apart on their contract. So if that gets stalled, maybe you do. Imagine Poirier versus Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz wants to fight. Nate Diaz wants to get back in there. So imagine that one. That would be a great one. You're right. There is really no other way to go. I feel strongly about Lee versus Vic. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think Vic needs to step up. Lee, still, just got an interim title fight, so a couple
The
of
only thing
fights.
that could
Don't you love that the outskirts of that picture we're talking about is like Gaethje or Barboza, things
Those
like
guys,
that?
yeah.
I mean, you could still.
By the way, I like that fight.
I know,
I
exactly.
think those guys need to take like 10 months off.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Those
But I'm
two.
like, you just look at even the guys that are just now in that outside of that, and so even those are intriguing. I can't remember the lightweight division being as compelling as it is right now.
That'd be awesome. Well, the only thing that would burst my bubble would be if some retired boxer came over to kind of do something. But I don't know.
We could talk. Yeah, come on. For a guy who hates talking about these things, you always bring it up. So, lightweight division is. We'll have a lot of time to talk about it, but I feel like we could do 30 minutes on the Merab Valishvili versus Ricky Simon finish that transpired on Saturday in Atlantic City. One of the most amazing sequences that I've ever seen watching this sport. I mean, 53 seconds. This guy is fighting off a guillotine like that. That looked like. I mean, it looked like his head was going to pop off at one point. It turned. I'm somewhat colorblind, but it seemed like it was a different color. And then the horn sounds, and I don't know about you guys, but I thought that he had survived and he was going to win this fight via decision, probably 29-28. At worst, a draw if you were going to call that a 10-8 round. And then they call it a TKO via technical submission. And since then, Mark Goddard, who wasn't the referee, but he was cage side and was the one that told Bruce Buffer, hey, wait a second, this isn't going to the scorecards, has defended the call, although he has said that it was a mistake to call it a TKO. Nick Lembo still says that it should be a TKO versus technical submission based on New Jersey's rules. John McCarthy has said that the right call was made. We have not heard from Liam Kerrigan, but it's still a very hot topic, and Valishvili himself has said that he is going to, or his manager wants to appeal it. What did you think while watching it? Like when the horn sounded, what did you think the call was going to be? And then what did you make of the call at the end? Forget about the TKO thing is I hate to call it semantics.
It's commission minutia.
But it does kind of raise a red flag that, like, wait a second, you guys got this wrong, and you're still, doubling down on it. What does that say about your decision-making process here? But for now, let's just ignore that because it is minutia. What do you guys make of it? And I want to know what you thought when the horn sounded, and then what you thought when they actually, announced the decision, Bruce Buffer.
I thought he had survived.
Yeah.
My first initial viewing. Then but then like we put it so Liam Kerrigan puts the hands on him and he gets off, and I was like, wow, he made it. I never seen anything like that in my life. To just sit there and
53 seconds.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. But then his head bounces off the canvas, and I'm like, and then they come back and everything happened the way it happened. My basic view on this is, apparently Liam Kerrigan's big mistake was he didn't go to the scores table and then request, because you still have to score the bout, even if it was a total stoppage in that way. But I saw people being like, well, what if he changed his opinion? What if he got pressured into adjusting his ultimate decision? I mean, there's exceptions to this. I'm really okay with that. I've been watching the sport for how long? And I've never seen anything like that. So that the next event or the one after that, MMA's capacity for batshittery is endless. And so my whole view on that is, okay, I mean, do I expect Liam Kerrigan or any referee to get that right in the moment? I don't. But even if you're pretty sure about your call, I would like to go see you use instant replay, especially in a state that affords it. He didn't do that. He didn't look at the call again. And last thing about this, I would like a commission representative, somebody. I know that Nick Limbo spoke to you that night, and that's something, but you need somebody on the broadcast to say, whether it's Mark Goddard or somebody, here's the call we made, here's why we made it.
Transparency.
I was just,
accountability.
Back in the day, didn't Matt Hughes win the welterweight championship basically unconscious? I mean, I remember he was it caught like in a triangle? Or,
so he slammed Carlos Newton.
And he slams Carlos Newton, and Newton goes out, and so did Matt, but nobody really looked at him. They were looking at Newton, and so he gets his arm raised. Now, what's the difference between that and this? I mean, I'm not saying this was a wrong call. I'm saying in a sense that maybe it's a good sign that they're taking closer looks at fighters as in those moments. I mean, this was a case where a guy seemed to survive, but he didn't. He was out. He was out as the horn sounded.
He was out.
Well,
I feel like he was out.
It's almost as if your intuition and logic was at odds with your visuals as you're watching, because that's what was going on with me. I'm like, wait a minute, he's out? No, he's not out. I mean, you just keep going back and forth. One side of the brain is not connecting to the other, and it's almost kind of like what's going on in that cage. I never thought he was out. I've watched it a bunch of times now, and I'm like, it doesn't seem like he's out. But then I can see the side of people who are like, no, he was out. I can see that side of it, but because it's all perception at that point, is judgment. I mean, you're seeing him make the motion. You hear it. I don't know when it was called off exactly, like right at the horn.
Yeah,
like
well, that's what they said.
I was told that Liam Kerrigan, we didn't see it on TV, but his call from the very beginning was fight's over.
But he made the call as the horn sounds. So, because it seems to me like one of the reasons you stop a fight is because the fighter can't go on. But at that moment, you don't need to go on.
But to me, it seemed like he made the call after the horn sounded.
Right, but that's okay. You can actually do that. There's a misinterpretation of this. If the fight ends and the bell goes, and then you separate them, and you notice someone's unconscious, you're technically making a decision after the bell. That is perfectly legal.
But did you see that point where Simone is pointing at him and saying he's out, and then he all of a sudden pops up? The guy deserves a second to rest. Like, people are saying, oh, he was lying on the mat. He had just been choked for 53 seconds. It's crazy to me.
But the thing is, the leg kicking thing, I did not buy Mark Goddard's explanation. It was involuntary. But I will tell you this: I've never seen someone's head bounce like that.
He's probably freaking tired.
I understand, but
think about the stress.
I understand. I was just saying that is usually 99 times out of 100. 99 times out of 100, that's somebody who's out.
Look, in baseball, there's that line: "Tie goes to the runner." This man deserved the benefit of the doubt. He was the runner here. It's not clear to me, unless it's crystal clear that he was out. It's not clear that he was out, and he deserves the benefit of the doubt for surviving.
I felt like it had to be more definitive.
Yes.
To say nope, it had to be more definitive than it was. I agree with you. There was a couple of moments there. That's what's so weird about it. There was just enough gray area to be like, well, I could understand. But seeing his head do that, I agree. But in my mind, it has to be more definitive than that to make that call. And that's what keeps bugging me about it.
Feels like a big leap of faith to say that he was out definitively.
This is the problem for me. This feels like the same problem we had with MMA judging. You talk to those referees who were there. Mark Goddard was on your show. What was the quote from the MMA fighting headline? There's no doubt in his mind. Yeah. You talk to those people in the commission, they're like, we don't even understand what the controversy is about. Watching on TV, we're like, I don't know about this one. And so this is my point. Whenever there's any kind of situation like this, where there should be a rule. And any time you about goes the distance and you want to call it a TKO or technical sub based on whatever the reason is, you must look at it on replay.
Yeah.
You must verify that call. And there's none of that.
It's livelihood. And the bottom line was, like you mentioned, he was either going to win or a draw. Now it's a loss. It flips just like that, just off of somebody's judgment.
And another reason why the show win bonus system is so unfair to these fighters. Now you're telling me that guy didn't deserve the extra whatever 15,000 that he was probably going to make. That Ricky Simone, who by the way, great finish. The crime in all of this is that Simone isn't being talked about for this kind of comeback finish, because I thought he was en route to losing, and then and pulls off a great move with 53 seconds left. More power to him. I wish he got everything that the show and the win. But man, it just feels like they did him dirty on that one. And not that they had any reason to. I just feel like they got it wrong. And what sucks is in our sport, there's no accountability. No one's talking. You haven't heard from Liam Kerrigan. Hey, props to Goddard. I may disagree with him, but at least he's actually coming out and facing the music when he really doesn't have to. Right. He wasn't even the official. And so that one just feels like I was watching. I was like, the man survived.
I like Matt Brown. Matt Brown on Twitter, he's like, it's just black and white. He just lays it out, and I'm like, well, when you say it like that, you're like, we're all a bunch of idiots even be debating it. You know what I mean? It's just because it seems like that ultimately. What
a sight, though. Him doing the bicycle. I don't even know what to call that. Just like moving his legs that way.
I called it. He tried to doggy paddle his way to consciousness.
It was incredible.
Well, he also he didn't have the ability to do. Sometimes the guys will just thumbs up or something.
I think he did it briefly, but that was
a little bit. But by moving something, it shows that he's not unconscious, or at least
so weird.
But I know that Goddard said that it was involuntary. It didn't seem involuntary to me.
How could you know?
But maybe it was. I guess I would have.
I would have forgetting what he had been through for 53 seconds. That is pretty darn traumatic.
I would have a different opinion about it, and I don't know the rules about this specifically. But I would have a different opinion if this were the end of the second round and there was more fighting to happen as opposed to the end of the fight. It seemed to me that even though he maybe was out at that moment after the horn, he seemed like he had made it to the horn. And I know you said that they do have the right to go and look at it afterward, but God, why bother? Why fight it off? If you're gonna, because if you make it to the final, I watched the Boston Marathon many times and see these people run 26.2 miles and they get to the finish line and they collapse, but they finish the damn race.
Yes.
And once you get to that finish line, that should be it.
Yeah. All I know is that I want to see that rematch. It was a really fun fight. The pace was just incredible. It was frenetic. I'd love to see that rematch. I say let's do it in Idaho.
Yeah.
FS1 main card.
Curtain jerker.
No. Let's put it on the main card.
No, we already got the curtain jerker.
We skipped over 10 topics because we went a little long at the top with all the stuff. But there's a lot going on. We'll address some of those after the beat. A lot of you have sent us questions, so we'll go to Twitter in a second. If you're watching us on Twitter, stay right there, live.twitter.com/MMA Fighting. If you're watching us on MMA Fighting or YouTube or Facebook, head over to Twitter right now. That's the address. It's the usual spot. But before we do that, our man Jeff Wagenheim, the man in the shirt, has some maybe sad breaking news, but wanted to give you the opportunity to break it yourself.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, this will be the last beat for me and my new responsibilities over at ESPN. I've been kind of filling in, helping out the combat sports people for the last month or so, while still doing mostly the other stuff I do, which has been NFL. I guess they got a big thing going on sometime this week, the NFL stuff, and then the NBA and Major League Baseball. But now I get rid of all those minor sports, and I'm going to focus all my attention on combat sports, and that will not allow me to come here to New York City on Thursdays. So more reason to watch the MMA Beat with the A+ team, or whatever we want to call it. And you know, before the show, I was looking at my first appearance.
Yes.
Episode number 16.
Wow.
Luke was not here.
Wow.
Although he might have been. He looked a little bit like Mark Raimondi, but the other two of you guys are here.
Okay.
And our topics were, is Tito versus Rampage worthy of a pay-per-view?
Wow.
You didn't get a chance to weigh in that time. Luke, do you have an opinion about that one?
Yeah, probably not.
Okay. Our other topic was the brand new innovation called Fox Sports 1.
Yes.
And I don't know whatever became of that, but anyway.
So what year was this?
This was August the 10th, 2013.
Wow.
I was like just out of college at the time.
5 years.
Yeah, I was
5 years.
I had just graduated college, and this was my first big break in the city.
Look what's become of you.
Yeah, so I just want to say to all you folks out there, thanks very much for watching, and continue to watch, because with these knuckleheads, I'll be commenting. I will be in the comment section from now on.
You know what I'm sad about? I'm not going to get a contact high sitting next to him.
Yeah. You've been a very important part of this show. I like to call you Mr. Reliable. You're always there no matter what. I even remember one time we were at Media Day in Boston for that, not the FS1 show, but a different one, Dillashaw versus Cruz, and I called you on like 2 hours notice that we were going to do one on the road with, I think, Esther and Chuck.
That's right.
And you got in your car and drove. So you've always been very reliable. You've been our iron horse. So thanks for everything that you've done for the show. But you're not done yet. We still got after the beat. So
Here we go.
buckle up here, because we're going to answer some questions. All right, let's go to Twitter right now. After the beat starts in a second.